watched the rest of the movie and laughed some more, right? And then felt okay. And I walked out, and as I walked out of the theater, and I'm walking out, and it's a beautiful sunny day, the sun hits me right in the eyes, and I'm just blanked out black, right? And as that happens, I go, oh, that's what he meant, right? So what he began to show me was that how we do some of our healing, right? A lot of our healing from an indigenous perspective. How it's done not so much from direct teaching, but it's done from a way of recognizing the knowledge and gifts of the individual that lies within them to be able to resolve and solve problems that they have. But our role is to help them identify that. So our role is to create the kind of the frame and help them create the questions and develop the questions that can help them to discover their answers that lie within themselves, right? That's one of the important things that he showed me. And then what he also showed me was, as I learned that, and I continue to learn the teachings, and I learned the creation story, and then all those teachings that follow, I came to understand also about what I wanted to learn more about in terms of how I would actually then be able to be of assistance and help within our communities, because he was showing me a completely different paradigm for healing, one that I didn't see anything of in my graduate degree. And most importantly, I did not see, and what I understood from as he helped me to see the pieces that are essential in our healing process and just in our life process, is that spirit is the foundation of being, right? And that's how we understand from an indigenous paradigm. We are spirit in human form. And the whole teachings and the work I even do today now, is all about that. And I do work with one of our other elders in this region. It's called Feather Carriers Leadership for Life Promotion, and we've reframed the paradigm of suicide prevention to life promotion. And so what he was showing me at that time was that other frame, right? And what is in that frame, again, is the teachings. Again, when we do our work, we teach about what's called the Mekon's teachings. So it's really, you could call it the developmental stages from an indigenous worldview, and it speaks to everything from beginning in spirit with Creator to coming into the human vessel, to coming out into the human form, to the journey of life and 7 stages of life that we go through before we then ultimately leave this form and return to the spirit world. So that perspective, was something I had some understanding of, because I was raised with spirit and spirituality through my parents, who were very committed to Christianity and Catholicism. But so I understood spirit in that way. When I looked at what was being taught about healing in an non-indigenous worldview, I couldn't see that anywhere, right? So I didn't see the evidence that there was any understanding that, psychology, for example, from non-indigenous perspective, recognized the significance and importance of spirit in terms of the healing process. And I searched for it, and I couldn't find it. I found a few little snippets of it. It was just starting, but it wasn't there. So then, in my graduate degree, I decided for my doctorate to actually study the paradigm shift, because at that time family therapy and systems theory was starting to come onto the scene. And they had created a first family therapy institute in Toronto called the C.M. Hinks Center, and so I did my placement there for my internship and studied family therapy. And I came to recognize, actually, through that experience fairly quickly, that this wasn't new to me, the systems theory, and particularly the paradigm and the ability to be able to see systems and think in systems. because I'd been raised that way, and although it wasn't labeled to me as that, my thinking was structured in such a way as to think about relationships, right? And that's very much our traditional indigenous worldview is based on relational perspectives about it, because everything is in relationship to everything else. And we see those interconnections, and we're taught those interconnections as we're raised, right? And it's whether our teachers, our parents, impart it directly or indirectly, there's the evidence of it being there. And I felt that because I wasn't, as I said, raised in our community. I was raised off reserve, but I was exposed to those very much intuitively and without it being, pointed to specifically. So when I did my training as a family therapist, I was able to take it on and learn it very quickly. It was like second nature. It wasn't totally new. The concepts and some of the labeling of the ideas were, but the actual experience of it was not. But my colleagues, most of them struggled with it. And most of them had come from, well, they did individual counseling. Their thinking was different in terms of how they were raised specifically. And so they struggled to form that systemic thought, right, to be able to think that way. So that's what I ended up choosing to do my doctoral dissertation on. I wanted to understand what happens to people when they go through this transition of, going from individual therapy to doing family therapy and essentially changing their thinking towards systems thinking and relational thinking.
They're called sociological imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Very similar.
Exactly.
Yeah. That shift.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's what I studied, and so that kind of framed for me further some of what I wanted to learn more about. And these other experiences that I had then with this elder ultimately led me to realize, and then the other thing that happened was I did my next internship out in Newfoundland in a hospital in a community called Corner Brook on the west coast of Newfoundland. And I was one of 3 psychologists. The person who had graduated from our program prior to myself a number of years before went out there and actually became the chief psychologist. He was the only psychologist serving the whole west coast of Newfoundland, so from Port aux Basques to St. Anthony's. So there were 3 of us ultimately, including myself, when I was there. There was a community psychologist, and then we were responsible for the in-hospital as well as for the psychiatric floor. And so that experience helped me to see, what really is happening in terms of rural psychology. The fact that it's so underserviced, and the needs that are there. And so that led me also now to start to think about where do I want to go when I graduate, and how do I, again, going back to the original question, how do I want to use those gifts now? So I was forming the knowledge base and understanding how it could be applied. And so I chose, and by the time I had finished working with the elder, that I would move to northwestern. Well, I didn't say exactly where at the time. I was wanting to move north and work in our communities. And a position came up just as I was finishing for northwestern Ontario, and it was the new development of the first child mental health center in northwestern Ontario. And so I applied for it, and I got the position. I became the first psychologist to work in northwestern Ontario, between Thunder Bay and Kenora. And so I was in Dryden, and I served our communities throughout all that region, which at that time was mostly non-Indigenous communities that we were working with. Tons of Indigenous communities in the region, probably a larger Indigenous population than non-Indigenous, but they set up the service as to be non-Indigenous focused. And again, they did so because of these kinds of jurisdictional issues, that where they say that the provincial government is responsible for the provincial citizens, all Indigenous people, the federal government are responsible for providing health care. And so essentially our communities were not, Indigenous communities were not being served. I started, the person I worked with who was the executive director was a pretty advanced thinker in terms of community psychology and a lot of the issues around equity and inclusiveness and, creating services that are not racist in delivery. And so we did have the opportunity to reach out to some, but it resulted ultimately in situations where those communities, like at one point I was asked to go into a community that was by and large Indigenous community. It was on the railway tracks, and it was there were a number of non-Indigenous families and community members who were living now in this town, which was not identified as a reserve, so it was kind of Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. And I was asked to go and do some assessments with Indigenous youth there, which I did. And it was interesting because my report showed that the non-Indigenous students, almost every one of them was graduating and going to high school and on to college or university. None of the Indigenous students were. At that point in time, there was one Indigenous student, a young girl who had actually graduated. And I started looking into what had happened and why that was. And what I discovered was that these children actually had, in testing, using the appropriate kinds of testing, because I also challenged the appropriateness of non-culturally based assessment tools, psychometrics. Right. And I was also helping to identify what were more culturally appropriate and how to do these assessments. Anyway, what I showed was that these children were just as bright as the non-Indigenous students, but there were too many racial issues and boundaries that stopped them from actually being successful in school and actually getting on to high school. But when I actually looked at it closely, I also discovered that this one student who actually graduated did not go to the one school that was actually run by the non-Indigenous school people. It was actually, she had gone to this school that was run by a religious group. I'm trying to think of which one it was. The Mormons, the Mennonites. It was a Mennonite smaller community was there, and they taught all of their own students, their children, in a way that was actually based on achievement. So once it was not graded. It was non-grading, and the way they taught was that you achieve certain levels of different courses at different rates, and so you only progress once you've completed all of them, right? And so you go through them. Anyway, that was their system, and this young girl had gone there, and she succeeded. There was a lot that I pointed out to what that was not working. It was not good for Indigenous students, and we got a report back from the school board indicating that they never wanted to see me again, and that I better be cautious in what I say.
Right.
So this is what was happening, right? So what ended up happening out of those experiences was ultimately, because the other thing that I discovered while I was there was that, so I did about, what was it now? I was about 3.5, almost 4 years there. And the other thing that we discovered is that I had other colleagues who were Indigenous ancestry working with this organization, all of whom, had identified the same issues I had, and we had shared our stories and were concerned that the services were not being provided. But the other thing that we saw was at that point in time, this was prior to the stopping of what they call the 60 Scoop today. So in the Northwestern Ontario, this was now it was in the 80s. And so at this point in time, the children were being apprehended out of our communities by non-Indigenous social workers who were trained primarily in Southern Ontario. And when they got jobs, they were only able to get them often in outlying areas. And so these were the ones who were working for this Children's Aid Society. And what was happening is that they had no clue about Indigenous communities, Indigenous society, Indigenous culture, and what they were doing was that they were hearing information about children either not being cared for, and so they would go and they'd go into the community And I heard many of these stories where they would go into the community, they see children kind of walking around, question them, and their parents wouldn't be there. They'd answer would be, well, my parents are not here. And they would then assume that they were not being cared for. But there were other family, because in an Indigenous community, people look out for each other and watch for each other's children, and they're all extended families. So, but they didn't understand lots of that. Many of these children ended up being apprehended. Some of them actually apprehended and adopted out, even before their parents could actually figure out where they were, how to handle the situation. And, it seems kind of not plausible when we think of it today, but it was happening. And I can tell you there was,
Well, it's
I
still
ultimately,
happening.
it does happen.
Maybe not quite as.
Not quite as
Well,
much, we're still struggling with that. The end result, though, was when we started to look at it, we were seeing that we calculated out that at the rate of the children that were being apprehended and then adopted out, because some of these children were adopted out into other countries. They were not only taken from the communities, but then they ultimately went out to these other. There were a lot of these organizations were adoption agencies that were, some of which were in the States. Children ended up going into those adoption agencies and then ultimately were adopted overseas. So, but when we looked at the rates of these children being apprehended, we could see that in 25 years, we calculated out, most of those communities would become non-viable because there would be no next generation coming along. That's how many children were being taken out and adopted away. So at one point in time, we actually ended up having a moratorium placed on the adoption of these children out of community. And I was part of that whole process, because after I finished working there, I moved out west and went out to Regina, and I worked in Regina with an organization actually was focusing on infant and child development, early years, primarily prevention kinds of approaches, working with the Indigenous community and non-Indigenous, but those that were recognized of families where the children were at high risk to have developmental delays. And we created, it was like a Head Start program. It was one of the early days of that kind of work. While I was there, I was then asked to go back to where I had been and consult with them, because by then we started to develop an Indigenous agency, which was actually once we put the moratorium on the children being adopted out, then we began to create Indigenous agencies, which were primarily at the beginning family support agencies. Family support agencies, from an Indigenous perspective, were really focused on community health and wellness and a rebuilding of these communities. So essential things like helping to develop parenting skills, because most of the parents had been in residential school. Residential school did not teach any of the children there how to be parents. It taught models actually that were mostly oppressive and abusive, forms of care, if you want to call it. It's not really care. But those were the models that they often had. And so, these kinds of behaviors got replicated. And then all of I could go on forever on all these pieces, but that ties back to all of the different traumas that then occurred, right? And these were multiple traumas going through multiple generations, and also tied back to the whole process of colonization, right? So you can start off with the experiences that had to do with, taking of the lands, restricting our people to have to live on reserves, and those became prisons because they were actually initially, governed by the government, were Indian agents, and Indian agents were the ones who actually controlled our communities as jailers. Mm-hmm. So our people were not even able to, until more recent generations, within 2 generations, that we were able to actually go off reserve without permission of the Indian agent. So you can imagine, what that kind of environment was. They again were environments where many of our people were starving because we didn't have sufficient food, because the food was now supposed to be supplied or brought, from the government. But, now that we couldn't hunt and fish and do all of our natural ways of supporting our lives and be self-sustaining, now we were dependent upon the government to do that. And it wasn't often good care. So many of our people died again as a result of the different illnesses because of poor nutrition, And that created then compounded, the circumstances. So, if you go, my own family, for example, my great-grandfather, my mother's father did high steel work, and they did steel work as a way of, again, finding a way, once we got off of the reserves,